Today I want to talk about the work of Maurice Cornelius Escher. His beautiful artistic work is hard to place. I mean, where to start and where to end, literally. His work is stunning, reflective, extremely creative, surprising, and these are some of the characteristics of great art. Great art has the ability, the power to arrest and to inspire us. And this is very clear and very prominent in Escher's work. In this video, I've selected a few of his works and I've created the video in the same manner that I do all the videos in this series, and that is I take some time, I do a deep dive into the life and works of a particular creative individual or group, and I try to frame these things in terms that are the most relevant to creativity, to great work. So I try to put it within the framework of the AIC, within the framework of the Worldly Atlas: Awareness, Intent, Creativeness. And this is what we will do today. So we will go around exploring Escher's work, exploring his interaction with the world of knowledge, the different worlds of knowledge that he interacted with, his interaction with plans, with vision, with risk-taking, resources, and finally creativeness. So how did all this come to be in the real world, in the market, within networks? We'll try to connect all that to his work and to his life. And you might feel that many of the things I say here in the series are subjective, and please bear with me on that. It has to be that way. This is admittedly so since the beginning, and this is how it all works. I've always, since college days, since the early 2000s, admired and loved Escher's work. And after I worked on the Atlas of Worldly Wisdom, I was looking at a painting because I have a book of his works lying around and I always go through it, just get absorbed into the works. And I saw a painting which was Liberation, and then I saw Verbum, and I thought, wow, could this have been the hidden inspiration I've had for the Atlas of Worldly Wisdom, particularly the Awareness, Intent, Creativeness, triple spiral? And because it has such a clear visual representation of the different dimensions, the clear visual representation of abstraction on the level of knowledge. As you go up, you let go of some of the details to create an approximate view, right? And this relates to approximate thinking, to create an approximate view that gives you sort of an idea of what is there. And on the other extreme, there is all this detail, right? On the side of creativeness, there is all these details, the specifics, the meticulous execution, and somewhere in the middle, you are lost. You have this empty space, this intent of trying to decide on which direction to go. And it struck me as something very clear. But I mean, you have this clear visual representation of these elements in so many paintings. It's not one painting, in so many paintings. But later, I think that this is just a reflection of a higher truth. Both of these ideas and many other ideas are a reflection of this higher truth of the world that has these two extremes. On the one side, there is the detail, the meticulous, but also the material. And on the other, you have this airy, broad, approximate, but more encompassing. You lose the details, but you cover more. And incidentally, this is present even in the works of Escher that don't have this access. This is a pattern of reality. And great art uncovers some of these patterns in reality. It makes them clear and it expresses them in different beautiful ways. And this is one of Escher's quotes, that what he is doing is something so pure and beautiful. And I believe that. And we will see that in the coming sections as we look at the knowledge dimensions, as we look at the planning, the vision, and the intent-related dimensions, and as we conclude by looking at how all this came to be in the world by looking at networks, the market, and his actual discipline and craft. Escher's works reflect many aspects, many faces of knowledge, of the interaction with knowledge. And it is no accident that his works, his themes are reflected in so many and are echoed in so many different fields of knowledge. So there are a number of characteristics, there are a number of themes and statements that are always present in his work and that constitute the essence of our approach, our attitude towards knowledge, towards awareness in a bigger and more integrated sense. First, there is the understanding of order versus chaos, and how order arises out of chaos and chaos arises out of order. And this is hinted at, or this is depicted by Escher in many of his works. We can see it in Metamorphose and many others. And metamorphosis and evolution are very prominently present too. So in the world of knowledge, we have this gradual step-by-step advancement that happens through a change of theories, through a change of understanding, through a change of measurement. And this is also beautifully reflected in many of Escher's works, in the transitions that we see in his work on tessellations, on the flows, and he explicitly calls it metamorphosis. Anyway, there is this duality of abstraction and concreteness that we see very clearly. Some of the pictures, the ones that have butterflies or birds or fish, and you can see how they evolve from being these abstract, simple shapes, approximate shapes, into being these detailed and intricate patterns without losing the qualities of filling up the space, right? And this interplay, this duality between abstraction and concreteness, detail and approximation, is very significant in Escher's work, but also in our understanding of how knowledge represents the world, and how, as we digitize the world, represent it in quantitative values, we sort of take away some of the edges, we take away some of the details for the purpose of being able to accommodate a broader understanding. This is how awareness works. The next point here, which is very important, is relativity and perspective. And this is something Escher has been fascinated by and is also depicted in many of his works. So the direction from which we look at something completely changes the object. And this could lead to the creation of the impossible. And one of the beautiful but very popular paintings here is Relativity, or Crazy Stairs, as Stewie would call it. And here the different perspectives come together into one painting, and we can see the impossibility of this, the absurdity even of this. And we can link that to the concept of the troublesome identity. I mean, Impossible Worlds also depicts this, and you can look at some of these pictures for quite a while trying to understand, why is this done this way or that way? And Escher actually has a very interesting quote on this subject. He says, well, how do you know that this floor can't also be a ceiling, and that you don't have to stand on your head to see the world in the right way? Something like that. So this relativity, this plurality of perspectives, as I've called it here, is beautifully descriptive of the world of knowledge in general. And here, the plurality of perspectives can be taken forward a little bit more through the sheer number of knowledge fields that have been influenced, affected, or related to the works of Escher and depicted in the works of Escher. Mathematics, crystallography, tessellations, cognitive science, philosophy, architecture. I read about some exhibitions where architects are trying to depict some of these spaces somehow. So his work has had influence on so many knowledge fields in different ways. So the works have also gone into academic textbooks, sometimes into regular textbooks, but in this, the artist plays the role of somebody who is inspiring the next generation of scientists, in a sense, right? You are young, you are in university, and you see some of these things and you are fascinated by them, and it drives you there. And this is a discussion we always have about some forms of art where somebody would say, well, what is the use of this? The relationship between art and science, between art and knowledge, is very dynamic. One of them feeds the other, and they inspire each other into a virtuous loop of continuous evolution. So Escher's work displays all these different characteristics of knowledge, and this is why it's thoughtful and reflective. You look at one of these paintings and you could be lost in the details for quite a while, trying to think about what all this means and about all the hidden relationships that are built there. And this is probably what he meant when he said, the things I'm trying to create are so pure and beautiful. And he said something a little bit more extreme, and I kind of agree. So these different aspects of knowledge are beautifully depicted in the work, but also the relationship is much more dynamic than that. Art reflects knowledge, drives knowledge forward, but also inspires knowledge. So if we want to talk about the intent dimension, which is the integration of planning, which is the improvement and compounding of planning, we need to think about the elements of freedom, identity, vision, risk, and possibly resources. The first idea here is this concept related to identity, to the self, which is a self-referential concept. Yes, how do you define yourself? In order to define that, you have to resort to the self. And this echoes a principle in computer science, a theme called recursion. And Hofstadter has a very interesting and beautiful book on the topic, which is called I Am a Strange Loop, and in which he references Escher as well. So as in the painting, drawing hands, the self is always constructing the self. And this is an ongoing process that reflects a persistent and inescapable incompleteness related to the self. So this incompleteness also reflects an element of freedom. You are always creating the self, but there is this subjective pursuit. And in this subjective pursuit, there is a unique voice that we need to find, because this subjective unique voice is probably the point of maximum impact of your work in general. It is the objective of the integration of the spirals. And so here, for example, Escher's work is both playful and serious. It is masterful and exploratory at the same time. It is external and internal. And here there is this very interesting story of when he had to move from Italy, and I'll talk about that when I talk about chance, and he sort of directed himself further inward. This is reflected in many of the paintings. I really love the Three Spheres one, because it shows how the self in different degrees reflects the world in different degrees of transparency. And the self doesn't fit into a particular category. Does this not fitting into a particular category create risks? Yes, a lot of risk. So here Escher, for example, had this issue of not fitting into any of the big art camps of his time. So he wasn't a surrealist, he wasn't an abstractionist, but this is inevitable. Sometimes, if you just don't fit, you will be an outsider. He expressed this a couple of times. He said that he feels more understood by mathematicians than by fellow artists sometimes. And this reflects vision and courage, right? Taking risk, but also taking risk based on your own image of the self. There is a lot of courage in this, and your identity is something that you have to construct with courage, because there is the one who is always looking, right? This beautiful painting, it's his own eye. So Escher, through this courage, through this clear identity, has created a very unique and identifiable brand, right? And this is something we can say about great artists, is that you can look at a certain work and say, okay, I know who did this. And there is this distinctive Escher style that we can identify easily in some of the works. This strong brand has impacts on the market, on the potential of these works to be commercially successful. And there are interesting examples here. Day and Night, for example, the artist himself printed more than 600 copies of this one up to the present day, where the Escher brand is more clearly and more strongly established than ever. So finally, art as an integration. Because, well, Escher has been called a visual mathematician sometimes. He has been called a philosopher with a pencil. And, in our own pursuit of our unique identity, of the expression of our unique identity, in our subjective pursuits, we don't fit nicely into one category, right? I hope. And so why should art? We always try to relate to the intersection of different fields. This is what we personally like. And there is this beautiful work that expresses that, and it is the same for art. And this is something I talked about in Fuzzy on the Dark Side too, which is the folly of isms. Sometimes we are driven by society, by the environment, to belong to one of the camps, but we don't nicely fit into particular camps. And the same applies here to some of these works. Art, in this case, in the case of Escher, is an integration of math, cognitive science, of philosophy, and of different fields even within that. And this all adds to the richness, but it also clarifies this unique, courageous identity that Escher has created. So the third dimension is creativeness the worldly implementation of these ideas, of this vision, of this knowledge. And here I will talk about the role of chance, the deliberate practice, and finally communities and networks and how they serve a very important role in the worldly implementation of all of this. So first, chance. I remember the Tyson quote, which I started the discussion of intent on before, and that is everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. And the idea here is that you can have all the plans in the world, you can have all the knowledge in the world, but eventually reality will punch you in the face, and everything depends on how you interact with this chance element, how you interact with this punch, how you interact with what life throws at you. And there are always in life these small events that have a disproportionate effect on our development, on our growth. Here, a couple for Escher were his visit to Alhambra in Spain, and he was deeply touched. And in Alhambra there are all these beautiful majestic patterns, but they are all geometric, and they express all the different rules of symmetry that are used in tessellations, which he focused on later to develop, and he self-learned the whole field. And he interestingly expresses his dissatisfaction with the fact that all of the works in Alhambra, they had these tessellations, but they are, in a sense, all geometric, so they weren't living forms. This is because of the Islamic doctrine. So this chance encounter created a passion, or kindled a passion in him for working with these patterns, working with tessellations. Then another important event is when he had to leave Italy because of the war, and he says that after that he kind of went more inward because he didn't see the beautiful landscapes that he used to see in Italy. Although I would argue that the awareness, the airy, the knowledge related component was always there, even in his landscape work. There are influences from teachers, and he talks about the influences from different teachers and why he decided to take this direction of working on woodcuts and these types of paintings. There is always the return to childhood, these passions that we have as children, and at some point we assume that they are gone, but we discover that they are still there, very much present, very much persistent. And Escher talks of the same way. Not growing up, Picasso talks of the same thing, reflecting these childhood passions that always come back. So how do we respond to the chance in the world? Well, deliberate practice, diligence, and iterations. And this is clearly reflected in the artistic process of Escher. He used to have so many sketches. He says, I have so many sketches. And then when he wants, or when a certain idea comes, he looks at these sketches and he develops one of them. And this is reminiscent of Leonardo da Vinci and his notebooks. Always taking notes, always allowing this mental curiosity to take you to different places in an awareness, high level sort of way, which you can later go dig deeper in and develop further. So taking these many sketches, but then refining only a few of them. And Escher actually says that he could fill a second life working on some of these ideas. And so there is a process of perfection of a certain style that is happening here through this continuous process of selection and refinement. And here we can look at the dimensions of plurality and execution and how they play together. The interplay of craft and vision. And Escher also talks about this, and this process reflects different levels. So he says that in a certain stage, the artist will be obsessed with craft. You want to perfect the way in which you do things. But then sort of the higher level ideas, the vision takes you, and you develop the ideas conceptually through different sketches, through different explorations. And he says, once this is clarified, I leave it up to the hands. So again, we go back to the craft. And notice there are different levels of awareness, intent, creativeness here, starting with the level of craft, then going into a knowledge, reflection, thinking related component, then going back into a level of craft that are on different degrees of awareness. This is very interesting. To take this further, another aspect of this plurality, so from the plurality of the craft to the plurality of people, and here community is another aspect of plurality, and this is very important in the Escher story. Communities have been instrumental to the development of his brand, the wide adoption, as we mentioned, his good relationships with mathematicians. His works were included in a prominent mathematical conference. There was an adoption by mathematicians of some of these concepts as their own. And he mentioned that they understand me better than some of my fellow artists. So this is stage one. His works were also adopted when there was the counterculture by hippies as examples of psychedelic art. And we have these different communities adopting the work. And this takes us to a brief reflection on memetics identity. And so here, for example, I argue in other works in research that there are these things called cultural resource sets. And these cultural resource sets serve different functions. They help us understand the world in manners that are related to our own identity. So in doing so, they kind of establish in-group identification. They give us communication tools, but they also give us, the communication tools are not just to communicate with the others, they're also to communicate with the selves. And these have to do with the characteristics of the symbols themselves. And here the argument is that Escher's works have become kind of a cultural resource set for a big group of people, notably mathematicians, people interested in science and art together. This is because his works are highly identifiable, as we mentioned. It's a very clear brand, and they provide this kind of visual language, but they are also reflective, and they serve this function of creating or delineating the in-group. Okay, there is also within this a very nice observation on the interplay between self-exploration, the exploration of the self that we mentioned in the previous sections, and self-expression, right? So a brand is based on clarity. Escher's brand is based on clarity. Escher's works are based on this clearly distinctive style. They are not clear in themselves that there is this built-in incompleteness. But networks themselves are based on identities and relationships. So we move from brands that are based on a clear expression to networks based on identities and relationships. And these connect to markets as ideas become mainstream. And I think this explains some of the commercial success of the works of MC Escher. So to conclude this discussion on Escher, we've looked at the knowledge dimensions of his work. We've looked at the different knowledge fields impacted and affecting this work. We've looked at dimensions of planning, intent, courage, risk-taking, and resources, deliberate practice, and how things came to be in the world, so the actual creativeness. And throughout all this, there is a very powerful element of subjectivity. This subjectivity, this personal interest has a strong force that can pull us to change our perspective sometimes. Beautifully reflected in Relativity, Waterfall, Belvedere, and so on. There is also, in so many other words, a beautiful interplay of the duality between abstraction and detail, and our attempt to understand the world. But as we try to understand the world, we see it in a more abstract sense, and we lose the details. While on the other hand, if we want to go deeper into the details, we lose the big picture, and our perspective changes somehow. And all of this power of subjectivity is very beautifully encapsulated, I think, in intersecting planes. This is a very beautiful metaphor. You have this two-dimensional space, but as you look at it, you imagine these other dimensions and you see how they all intersect to form a particular perspective. And this is what we said was your own particular perspective is usually very hard to fit within a single field. How successful is Escher? We are always trying to ask this question. So as I mentioned, Day and Night had 600 copies printed by the artist himself. Escher merchandise in terms of t-shirts, mugs, puzzles sells a lot throughout the world today. He has crossed into mainstream. I read that there was one exhibition in Brazil, which was a 6-week exhibition that received like 800,000 visitors. So what does success mean in art? We are always asking this question and arguing over this question. Sometimes it's enough if it's meaningful to you, right? And there is this subjective dimension that is always counterbalancing the objective ones. As I tried to prepare for this video, I had so many ideas, and as I conclude this now, I can see all these other ideas that I didn't talk about. So many ideas are left unexpressed, because the more I thought about one of the meanings depicted in one of the images, the more relationships, the more meanings referenced to by these works I found. And so this was a bit problematic, because how many details and how much can I fit into a 25-minute video anyway. Perhaps I'll expand on some of these topics in the podcast. Leave some comments if some particular areas are of more interest. I know this has been somehow subjective, but this takes me to the final reflection of this episode, which is, well, the great integration and incompleteness. So I mentioned that there is this great integration that is related to our great work usually. The great integration is when you try to focus your efforts into bringing together all your resources, all your efforts, all your practice, all the people you know towards this one objective, which is usually the point of maximum impact. And here, Escher's great integration is really beautiful, bringing together all these knowledge fields, all these explorations. But interestingly, it is always coupled with incompleteness. Even this great integration will always be incomplete. The self is a work in progress that is always happening, always being discovered as it is expressed, right? So self-expression and self-discovery. And this is an elegant destiny, because perhaps our deepest thoughts when we reflect on the world and when we reflect on ourselves can't stop at one field or discipline. It has to go beyond, it has to see all these different intersecting planes. So maybe just taking some time off to contemplate and to be lost in a work of art is enough sometimes.